My name is Larry Scogan. It's my good fortune to be the president of Bismarck State College, and I want to welcome all of you. What a marvelous turnout we've had for a cold, wintry kind of day. We really appreciate all of you coming here to Bismarck State for a conversation on John F. Kennedy. And my good friend Clay Jenkinson says I'm not going to introduce him today, so I'm not going to, but please welcome Clay Jenkinson to our stage. Larry.
So, just before we start, first of all, thanks for coming today, but how many of you remember exactly where you were on the 22nd of November? Look at that, Larry. And everyone else is too young.
Yeah,
I mean, but
yes.
There's virtually no one who was alive that day who can't say precisely where they were.
That's absolutely right.
One of the pivotal moments in the history of the United States.
Yeah. And for the young people that are sitting out here, it's like 9/11 or maybe the space shuttle when it exploded. I'm sure they can remember, for the young people, they can remember where they were when that happened, but it certainly affected our generation. So.
Think of that.
Yep.
Do it again, one more time. Everyone, that is just so amazing.
It is.
I mean, there's almost nothing, how many of you remember where you were when Dwight Eisenhower died? You know?
Yeah. Well, no. Yeah.
How many of you remember where you were when Richard Nixon resigned?
Oh, I remember that.
So, you can see, but the big moment of our lifetime of people who are older than 55 or so years old is that moment in Dallas.
Yep. And so we've got a lot to cover today, which is why we're dispensing with introductions, and we're going to get right into the information. But you've got a lot of handouts today, and so I'm going to very quickly go through the handouts. And but first thing I want to point out, by the way, I don't know if you picked these up coming in, but I'm very proud of our mystician staff. They put together, it's a political party voter's guide. So if you're still wondering who you're going to vote for or what positions are, it's a great thing. It's a great service that our mystician staff, the newspaper staff here on campus is doing for all of our young people. It's completely nonpartisan. Yep. It even has inside here North Dakota's own Gary Johnson, which is why there hasn't been a big groundswell of favorite sonism here on that. But Gary Johnson was governor of New Mexico. I think he was from, Minot or Jamestown? Minot? From Minot originally, and he's running on the Libertarian Party. And then about the majors, there's a number of majors. So really some very informational stuff, and so pick one up on your way out if you didn't get one. If you don't have the schedule for the upcoming conversations, I encourage you to pick one of those up. Our next one is in December, where we're going to talk about Charles Dickens in America. And Clay's making me read a book that Charles Dickens wrote about America, so I'm learning a lot.
Yeah.
Thank you. Also in your handouts you have critique, evaluation we call it, audience evaluation. Please fill it out and drop it off out there with Robin on your way out. We really take seriously, we read them all. If you've got any constructive criticism, if you've got negative criticism, if there's topics that you would like us to talk about, please go ahead and fill that out and drop it off. Then for today, class, these are all the handouts that you have, and I'm going to go through them very quickly, make sure you have them all. John F. Kennedy timeline that Clay put together, and Clay's going to want to go through that here in just a minute. And I don't know that we're going to get to all these handouts, but take them home with you and sit down and read them closely.
And can I interrupt you just to say,
yes,
here's why, because today we're talking about John F. Kennedy, and we won't get much accomplished, particularly if we keep doing all this, but a year from now, exactly a year from now, next year, the 5th, the 6th, the 7th of November 2013, on the month of the 50th anniversary of the assassination of John F. Kennedy, we're going to have a major national public humanities symposium right here in Bismarck. It's co-sponsored by the Dakota Institute, which I direct, Bismarck State, which you preside over, and the State Historical Society of North Dakota. It'll be held mostly up on the 4th floor of your energy building, but partly at the new expansion of the Heritage Center and elsewhere, and it's going to be really remarkable. So these materials that we're handing out are sort of getting you ready for that, and put this on your mental calendar. We have copies of this today, and if you need more to send to people or whatever, just let us know. But this is really going to be something, I think.
It's going to be great, and we're going to talk more about it here in just a little bit. But you got the John F. Kennedy timeline. We'll go through that a little bit. You've got the statement from Senator John F. Kennedy when he announced he was running for president. You've got the entire inaugural address, and Clay's going to talk much more about that, but you've got a full copy of it in your handout. There's a timeline on the Cuban Missile Crisis, and we're going to go through that when we get to that. There's also what was at one time a top secret telegram that was sent by the commander of the Continental Command about nuclear weapons, and we're going to go through that when we get there. And one of the things we probably won't get to, but I found incredibly interesting, and I think all of you will want to read that, and there's a poem there by Alan Seeger, who was killed in World War I, and he wrote a poem called Rendezvous, and it was John F. Kennedy's favorite poem, and in fact, Jackie Kennedy memorized it, and at times John Kennedy would ask her to recite it for him, and she would recite this poem. So I don't know that we're going to get to it today, but certainly read it at your leisure. Sort of how John Kennedy was thinking about his own mortality as a very young man. And so anyway, that sort of plays out, I guess. But okay, so that's the handouts that we have, and let's go ahead and jump into this, Clay.
Well, I want to start with just something. You know, he was here a number of times in North Dakota. There were, I think, 5 visits. And the last visit that John F. Kennedy made to North Dakota was just 2 months before his assassination. He was at the University of North Dakota. Some of you were there on the 25th of September, 1963. And it was a really remarkable event. I was just up at UND doing some research about it. And it was, there was a sort of sense of, for everyone who was there that day, that they had a special valedictory moment with John Fitzgerald Kennedy. And he said this, Larry, and I thought because it's the work that you do here at Bismarck State, that it'd be fun just to go over this one sentence, or this one paragraph. He mostly was speaking about conservation at UND, and he also talked about garrison diversion, the garrison diversion project. But he said this: I urge those of you who are students here to recognize the obligation which any educated man or woman must bear to society as a whole. This school was not developed merely to give its graduates an economic advantage in the life struggle. We do not seek merely, I am sure, at this school to graduate lawyers or farmers or doctors who may lead their communities in income. What we seek to advance, what we seek to develop in all of our colleges and universities are educated men and women who can bear the burdens of responsible citizenship, who can make judgments about life as it is and as it must be, and encourage the people to make those decisions which can bring not only prosperity and security, but happiness to the people of the United States and those who depend upon it. That's a beautiful definition of education, isn't it?
It is.
It's not just economic, it's not just credentialing, it's to create complete human beings.
Complete citizens, responsible citizenship.
Yeah, so I thought that was amazing that he said that at UND. Come back to it when we talk about Kennedy wit and humor. He also got off a great joke at UND, but let's look at the timeline. If you have that in front of you, the Kennedy timeline. Most of you are basically familiar with the life of John Kennedy, but I thought it would be interesting, Larry, just to point to a couple of things, and then you just jump in, because I know you have some thoughts about some of them. Born May 29th, 1917, he would be 95 years old.
Think about that. You know, John Kennedy is forever locked in our minds as a very young man. He would be 95 on May 29th of this year.
We'll come back to his illnesses later. I've put them in italics and underlined them. Went to Choate, one of the most prestigious boys' academies in the United States, graduated 64th out of 112. He hadn't yet begun to distinguish himself intellectually. He enrolled at Princeton briefly, but he was ill and had to drop back, and then went to Harvard, where you can see in 1940 he graduated cum laude. He also wrote a book. His senior thesis at Harvard was turned into a book, Why England Slept, about the appeasement and Great Britain's lack of preparedness for World War II. Becomes a U.S. Navy man, and you see on August 3rd, 1943, his PT boat, PT-109, was sunk in Blackett Strait in the Pacific. You better explain that.
Yeah, I think those of us, everybody that raised their hand earlier, if we say PT-109, you know what it is immediately. I was talking to a staff member, a young staff member, and I got into this about his PT-109 and what he did and how heroic it was, and she said, "What is a PT-109?" And it really stopped me, because those of us of our age just assume everybody knows what PT-109 is. But for you younger folks that are out here, the PT boat was a patrol vessel, and John Kennedy was assigned as a Navy ensign down to in the South Pacific and to a squadron of these PT boats. And they were very unseaworthy boats, made of plywood and tin, and there wasn't much to them. But they would go out on patrols. And while he was out on one of those patrols one night, a Japanese destroyer just out of the haze sliced it in half. And he had 12 crew members on the PT boat. 2 of them were killed, and the rest of them went to, he got the rest of them to an island. There's great heroic stories about swimming for 4 hours.
Through shark-infested waters.
Yeah, and dragging his badly burned senior mate, I think it was, that whole time with a strap in his mouth. And it's just really a heroic story. Anyway, they're saved by Australians eventually through the intervention of some natives that lived nearby. And he became a war hero from that.
In fact, he won the Purple Heart and the Navy and Marine Corps Medal. And on the basis of that, this is one of the things that launched his political career. This story, even though he was a minor hero compared to some other heroes in the war, this was part of the Kennedy legend. Very important, August 12, 1944, his oldest brother, Joseph Kennedy Jr., is killed when a plane that he's piloting in the war explodes over Britain. Explain why that's so important, Larry.
Well, I think it's important because, in fact, we're probably jumping ahead here, but there's sort of a thought of a Kennedy dynasty. Everybody believed that Joe Sr., the father of Jack Kennedy, and he had 4 sons, and it's Joe Jr. and Jack, or John, and Bobby, and then Ted. And the idea was that Joe Kennedy Jr. was then going to be a prominent American. They were going to break out of the Catholic Irish prejudice that the family had lived with, and Irish Catholic had lived with for centuries in this country. They were going to break out of that, and Joe Jr. was going to be the one that was going to do that.
The major political figure in the family.
And his death, of course, meant that mantle fell then to Jack Kennedy.
Who had not expected that this would happen to him. He did not expect to be Bill Clinton wanted to be the president of the United States when he was 16 years old, when he actually met John Kennedy through Boys Nation. But John Kennedy did not have aspirations to be the president of the United States. He assumed that his adored older brother would take that role. 1946, elected to the House of Representatives, narrowly defeating the incumbent. In 1952, elected to the United States Senate. September 12, 1953, marries Jacqueline Lee Bouvier in Newport, Rhode Island. 1957, when he was recovering from his second back surgery, from which he nearly died, he wrote the book that won him the Pulitzer Prize, Profiles in Courage. It was published in 1955, but it was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize in 1957, and it won. Then you see in 1960, he becomes the President of the United States. If you turn the sheet over, this is another important date, September 26, 1960, the first ever televised presidential debate. And we just learned, Larry, how important presidential debates are. Barack Obama's poor performance in the first of the 3 presidential debates this year may have cost him the election. It certainly set back the lead that he held until that time, but the first ever televised presidential debate was in September of 1960 between Richard Nixon and John Kennedy. We'll come back to that a little bit later. He defeats Richard Nixon by the narrowest of margins. In fact, many Republican operatives urged Nixon to challenge the election and demand a recount because there was considerable evidence of mishandling of ballots in Mayor Daley's Chicago.
Chicago, of all things.
But Nixon, as a patriot, chose not to challenge the election. And then I want you to just reflect on this for a minute, Larry. April 17, 1961, the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion. And first of all, explain what happened and explain why it's important for what follows in the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Well, I don't know how in depth we want to go on the Bay of Pigs, but the reality is that the Eisenhower administration had already decided, working with the Cuban exiles, that there was going to be an invasion, and it was going to be supported by air power, which was going to be vitally important.
U.S. air power.
U.S. air power. It was going to be supported. They were going to land on a beach They were going to go in, and if things fell apart, they could easily, it was thought, run off to the mountains, and then they could get this insurrection going. And Kennedy decided really at the 11th hour to pull the air support from it.
He did the first one and pulled the second, without which it couldn't succeed. It probably wouldn't have succeeded anyway, but now he doomed it to failure by not sending in the second airstrike.
And so it was his very first international crisis and his very first huge failure, and his popularity in the United States went up.
To 95%.
Yeah. Kennedy.
Imagine this today.
Yeah, and part of Kennedy's wit, and I'm not Kennedy and I don't have the wit, but what he was talking about is if you keep failing, you just become more popular in this country. And so the Bay of Pigs made him a very popular man.
But what did he learn from this?
About generals?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Kennedy says after the Bay of Pigs that the first thing I'm going to tell my successor, which of course he never had a chance to do, is that you don't believe generals just because they're generals on military matters. Sorry, General. We do have a general with us. But that not to believe generals on military matters. And he became very, very skeptical of the advice that he was getting from the military. But as a result of this, too, he was very skeptical of the advice he was getting from the CIA. And in fact, he asked the director of the CIA to resign after this. It was just a total botched job.
But because of the Bay of Pigs, which was a setback, but essentially a minor setback, major at the time, minor historically, but because of the skepticism, even cynicism he thereafter felt for the military establishment, that might have saved the world in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis, because, as we'll say when we get to it, but he was being pressed extremely hard by the Joint Chiefs and by the military to do a preemptive strike against the missile complexes in Cuba or to take it all the way to nuclear. And Kennedy, who was somewhat embittered by the Bay of Pigs experience, stood up to the military establishment when he might have succumbed, and who knows what would have happened had he done it. So that's a pretty important, an early failure is often useful for a president. So then if you go to June 3 and 4, he meets with Khrushchev in Vienna, and Khrushchev sort of beats him up and mauls him effectively in their diplomatic exchanges. And that's essential too, Larry, because Khrushchev may have underestimated Kennedy based upon the Bay of Pigs and the Vienna summit. In other words, when the Cuban Missile Crisis comes, he probably thought he could overawe Kennedy, and it turned out that he couldn't. September 12, 1962, the space program gets its most famous pronouncement when Kennedy says at Rice University that we are dedicated to putting a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth within this decade. And then October 16 through 28, 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. We'll come back to it. June 11, 1963, his first great foray into civil rights, sends the Alabama National Guard to the University of Alabama to protect 2 black students, and gives a major civil rights speech on television to the nation that night. September 25, 1963, his time at UND. Talk about this for a moment, Larry, because we may not get a chance to come back to it. November 63, the Kennedy administration's complicity in the coup d'etat in Vietnam.
We're not going to get back to that?
Well, we can wait if you want.
Yeah, let's wait.
Okay.
Because that's really an important
Yeah, we'll
piece.
never be back, but that's fine. And November 22nd, 1963, 12:30 p.m., assassinated in Dallas. There's lots more in the timeline, but that sort of gives you a quick and dirty sense of the life and political achievement. 3 terms House of Representatives, 2 terms Senate, 1,000+ days as the 35th President of the United States. So let's just quickly go on. This is the Humanities Symposium next November. We have some video clips we want to play, but I got an email this morning from a friend of mine who lives in Illinois, and he said, I think he's 30 years old, and he said, if you do this program today, try to explain what the Kennedy mystique is all about. So I just put together a few slides, Larry, and you can comment on them. Glamour and wit, grace and beauty, mind and idealism, youth and vitality.
Let's back up just a second. Let's just comment about
Sure.
this.
Yeah.
You know, I think that Americans, one of the things that really helps the Kennedy mystique is the fact that Americans were very tired of the old regime, if you will. They had 8 years of Eisenhower. Eisenhower had a number of heart attacks. You know, I think that Americans were just tired of that America, and they were looking for something that was exciting and new and wonderful and, and all this sort of stuff. And into the spotlight then steps John Kennedy and with his beautiful wife Jackie. And it just, I think that's part of what created the mystique, is they went from sort of an old stodgy general to all of a sudden this very glamorous couple.
And he says famously in his first inaugural address, let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike, that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans born in this century. Yep. You know, I'm not one of them. I'm not Eisenhower and that graying World War II crowd that we admire, but their time is past. The torch has come now to a new generation, and I represent that generation. I've done it. Yeah, thanks.
Good job, Mr. Jenkinson.
I'll pass the torch to you, Larry.
There we go. Let's hit this one. There
Yeah.
we go.
So great looks, of course. Look at that photograph. Is that a great photograph?
I think we got a clip about Jackie.
We'll come to it in a minute. Yeah.
I think that's the next
do you want
clip.
to do it now?
Okay.
So let's do it. Let's play the clip. This is an example of his great wit.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Minister, Mr. Secretary of State, Ambassador Alphonse, Ambassador Gavin, Ambassador Bonet, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I do not think it altogether inappropriate to introduce myself to this audience. I am the man who accompanied Jacqueline Kennedy to Paris, and I've enjoyed it.
He was an amazingly witty man and a funny man, and he had that you saw the timing. He played a deadpan, maybe not inappropriate for myself to introduce myself, and you expect him to give a little CV, and then he drops that piece of wit. That was that deadpan, ironic, somewhat detached, slightly sarcastic sense of humor that he had his whole life. I just made a list of a few of them today. He said, "Forgive your enemies, but never forget their names." He gave a speech about religious freedom in Houston in 1960. He said, "I believe in an America where religious intolerance will someday end, where every man has the same right to attend or not attend the church of his choice." He says, after the election, "I just received the following wire from my generous daddy. Dear Jack, don't buy a single vote more than is necessary. I'll be damned if I'm going to pay for a landslide." Of being president, he said, "The pay is good and I can walk to work." He says, "When we Democrats got into office, the thing that surprised me most was to find that things were just as bad as we'd been saying for years." He said, "I'm not going to appoint my ambassadors on the basis of campaign contributions. Ever since I said that, I haven't gotten a single cent from my father." He got an honorary degree from Yale, a PhD, and in his acceptance speech he said, "It might now be said that I have the best of both worlds, a Harvard education and a Yale degree." And on, but my favorite is something he said about Robert Kennedy. He appointed Robert Kennedy, who was just a child really, to be the Attorney General. And this was an example of terrible nepotism, and it probably wouldn't even be permissible politically today. But he was asked about it, and he said, and Robert Kennedy had never practiced law. And he said, he did have a law degree from the University of Virginia, and JFK said, "I just wanted to give Bobby some legal experience before he practices." And of Washington, D.C., JFK called Washington, D.C. a city of southern efficiency and northern charm. So He was an amazingly witty man. And then he said that famous thing about Jefferson when he had the Nobel Prize laureates. And I've seen the original document. It's like the ones you've gotten in your handouts. It was boilerplate written for him by the White House staff. And he was hosting 35 Nobel Prize laureates in the White House. And he penciled in this piece of wit by himself. It wasn't one of his speechwriters. And he said, this is the largest gathering of talent and of knowledge in the history of this building, I believe, except possibly when Thomas Jefferson dined alone. But you know, he had that capacity. That wit really matters. And when he first did his news conferences on television, he was the first president to hold a live news conference on television. And his aides said, absolutely not. You could make a verbal slip. You could do something that touched off nuclear war. If you flub in some way or give an imprecise answer in a conference that's not televised, that'll never appear in the newspaper. So why would you expose yourself live this way? And he said, I'm going to do it. And then he did it with such wit and charm that no matter what he said in the responses to the questions, his popularity kept going up. And so he knew how to use that capacity, and he was a master of it. Assets. Jacqueline Kennedy. I mean, look at that photograph. And how about this? This is later in her life, but what an extraordinary woman she was, and not just because she was beautiful and charming and had great style. She was elegant. She knew several languages. She is deeply well-read. She renovated the White House in an astonishingly intelligent way. Adorable children. I chose not to do the famous photograph of the desk, but
Yeah.
A rich, ruthless father, a deep political bench. Look at those.
Think about this. There were actually 4 brothers.
And
right?
all the sisters, too.
Joe is missing from this. But yeah, just the brothers. The only one in that picture that died of natural causes was Ted Kennedy. Joe dies in World War II flying an airplane loaded with TNT, and it blows up someplace over the channel.
The channel.
Jack, of course, is assassinated. Bobby's assassinated. And then Ted dies a natural death.
This is what he said about that. Just as I went into politics because Joe died, if anything happens to me tomorrow, my brother Bobby would run for my seat in the Senate, and if Bobby died, Teddy would take over for him. And that's sort of what happened. I mean, it was a very imperfect run, but the Kennedy brothers had enormous power in this country for a long time. Robert Kennedy was a major asset to his brother. He was sort of bad cop and did a brilliant job of it. Television, that debate, almost everyone here, I'm sure, has heard this, but people who listened to it on radio scored it higher for Nixon over Kennedy. But people who watched it on television said that Kennedy won the debate, and it was because of this famous smile and his charm and his, you remember what he said when you've been reading Caro's book, when he went down to debate Lyndon Johnson in Texas? Can you tell that story?
I don't know which parts you're after.
Well, that he was so charming and...
He puts me on the spot like this,
Yeah. I thought you'd read the books, yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, you told me this the other night. So that he goes, the Democrats of Texas invite LBJ as a candidate to come down and debate Lyndon Johnson.
Go ahead.
And so his advisors say, don't go, you're going into Johnson country, they'll just beat you up down there. And he went down for the debate, and he was so disarming and humble and charming, and he said, Lyndon's a great man, and his policies are really the right ones for Texas, and I look up to him. And by the time it was over, he'd won over everyone in the crowd, not by being aggressive,
all Texans,
but he did it by making fun of himself and not being bombastic and boasting. If you watch the debates this year, the sheer amount of aggression and boasting has been appalling. And Kennedy had a different path, which was the path of being lighthearted, and contrast with the elderly Eisenhower. And then friendship with scholars, poets, artists, etc. This is Robert Frost at the Inaugural. It was a windy, blustery day. There had been a blizzard, and they actually had to use torches, flamethrowers, on the streets to get the streets ready for the inauguration. It was such an appalling day. And there were traffic jams, and people couldn't get in and out of the city. And Robert Frost read or recited his poem, The Gift Outright, which is one of his greatest sonnets. But he had a preface that he had written, and he eventually had to not do it because it was so blustery and windy. And you see LBJ coming in from the right to try to hold the elderly poet's papers so that he can actually read that preface, but he couldn't. But look at this. I just made a little compilation here. Do you have the thing? See if I can make it work. These are the people who were in the Kennedy White House. This is Gore Vidal, who is actually related to Jacqueline. This is Pablo Casals. And here's one of my most favorite pieces of presidential trivia. Pablo Casals performed for John and Jacqueline Kennedy in the East Room, but he also performed for Edith and Theodore Roosevelt in the East Room. Think of that. In the early part of the century and the late mid-century, John Steinbeck, who was at the inauguration, I'll tell a Bill Guy story about that in a minute, Leonard Bernstein, this is John Glenn, Barbara Streisand, Frank Sinatra, no explanation required here.
Marilyn Monroe for you young people.
Yeah. So let me tell my Steinbeck story. This is such a great Bill Guy story. So Bill and Jean Guy were friends of the Kennedys. They went to the inauguration. They went to the White House 4 or 5 times, and they tell really funny stories about it. And one time they went, and the entertainment was Basil Rathbone. Remember him? He was an Irish poet and reciter of poems, and he was the entertainment that night. And so Bill and Jean are sort of, the way they tell it, and I'm sure it's not true, but they were sort of fresh off the farm, and they rented gowns to go off to this gala. And they got to the White House, and they went together through security, and they came up to the host, and they said, we need our seats, our dinner tickets. And so the host hands them this envelope, and they open it up, and Jean Guy is sitting at table 1. And Bill Guy looks at his ticket, and he's table 85. He's the governor of North Dakota. And Jean Guy said to the usher, there must be some terrible mistake. I mean, my husband's the governor of North Dakota. I'm sitting at table 1. He's sitting at table 85. And the usher said, and Jean quotes this beautifully, he said, "Madam, we do not make mistakes." So Bill went to his table, and Jean went to her table. Jean was sitting next to Douglas Dillon, the Secretary of the Treasury, on one side. JFK was on the other side of Douglas Dillon. So the President of the United States is here. Jean Guy is here, and on her left, I said, who's sitting on your left? And she said, a novelist named John Steinbeck. And I said, you were sitting next to John Steinbeck? And here's what she said. It was so cute. She said, yeah, and I didn't like it very much because I don't really like his novels. And I said, I hope you didn't tell him. You know? And she said, yeah, I mean, all that dreary stuff about depression and farms and dust bowls. I said, I just don't like his work very much. And I said, well, what was he like? And she said, he was just completely charming. And then she said, at the end, when we were getting up to leave, my purse was down by the bottom of the chair, and John Steinbeck saw this, and he said, Madam, allow me to pick up your reticule. And she said, I've never forgotten that. He was the first person who ever said reticule in my presence. So I'm having this interview with them, and she's telling this story, and it's just delightful. And then I turned to Bill Guy and said, who were your table mates? And he said, I have no idea. So, I mean, this was something. This White House was something, and we're going to have something about this on our symposium next year, but the style, the arts. When Mrs. Kennedy decided to renovate the White House, she poured herself into it, and it became the most major renovation of the White House since the Roosevelts did it in 1904.
And the Rose Garden that we always talk about was hers.
It's hers,
Her
yeah.
creation. Today they talk about news conference at the Rose Garden, announcements at the Rose Garden, and that was Jackie Kennedy. Okay.
And the space program. And we're going to have at the symposium next November Craig Nelson, if he'll come, who was here if you came to the to the Severide Symposium. Yeah. And he's an expert on this, but just say the one piece about that you know about. Do you want me to do it?
No. About his real lack of enthusiasm.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Okay.
No, please, yeah.
Well, no, he just told us that Jack Kennedy was really not enthusiastic about the space program. We think of him as being enthusiastic about it, but it was just kind of a throwaway.
He was shopping for things.
Something, you had to come up with something, so he came up with oh, well, this sounds like a good idea. With the, before the decade is out, we'll go to the moon and come back. Whew, glad I got that off, right? And then it turned out that that's what we remember him for.
He launched it as a kind of a trial balloon to think, well, we'll see if it gets any traction, and then it became a signature piece of his leadership. All right, so getting there. How did he become president? Here he is at the age of 10. Look at that Irish face. Talk about his illnesses a little bit.
Well, I think this is the most amazing thing as we think about Jack Kennedy. The most amazing thing is that he is a very ill man.
All of his life.
All his life. It starts off when he's a child. He's sickly. He's in the hospital a lot. He has, I think, last rites administered 4 times before November '63, because they thought he was dying. He would have some kind of back surgery. He had a congenital deterioration of the spinal column. He had many diseases that they couldn't figure out. One time they thought he had leukemia. Turns out that he was misdiagnosed. And then, so at any rate, then they finally, I think 46, they figure out he's got Addison's disease.
Which is an adrenal problem, a very debilitating and often fatal adrenal issue.
To me, the most important piece of this is that he was sick all of his life. He gets into the Navy because of his father's intervention. He ends up in the South Pacific because of his father's intervention. If he had been any other American citizen, that wouldn't have happened.
He wouldn't have passed the physical.
Which he failed the first time, and then both for the Army and the Navy. So then, because of his father's intervention, he ends up finally then down in the South Pacific. The saving grace for Jack Kennedy is what happened to PT-109. Because after PT-109, and now he's got his Purple Heart, and he contracted malaria while he's down in the South Pacific. Now when he comes home, and in the late 40s now when he's running for Congress, and now when he's in and out of the hospital, and he's walking on crutches, and he's wearing back braces, everybody says it's his war injuries. It's because he's a veteran, it's because he won a Purple Heart, and as Chris Matthews in a book that we read getting ready for this said, and he let it stand. That's very interesting, and he let it stand. So, very sickly individual. What he managed to do is transform then his wartime into the reason that he was sickly. And then everybody accepted that. They were very accepting of the fact that, well, he sits, and I remember growing up and seeing him in his rocking chair, and everybody said, well, that's because he was on PT-109. He would have been in that rocking chair regardless of PT-109. He would have had all these illnesses regardless of PT-109. So he's in and out of hospital a lot.
And this biography by Robert Dallek, An Unfinished Life, which I just reread, it's a very it's not my favorite biography of Kennedy, but it's a very interesting one because he was the first historian biographer to go into these illnesses in a very big way. And he recounts them really too much. I think he overemphasizes this. But he says, and I saw interviews with him when the book was published, he says if the public had known how ill John Kennedy was, they would not have made him president of the United States. And in addition to that, throughout his presidency, he was taking intensive cocktails of dangerous drugs, steroids, a range of other drugs that had potential mood-altering effects. Some of them could have been lethal because he was taking them so repeatedly, he was self-administering them. He had doctors who were cooperative that would give him this sort of thing. And he was, according to Dallek, a very ill man through the 1,000+ days that he was the president of the United States. And Dallek's view is, fair enough, he got away with it, thanks to a largely appreciative press. But the fact is that today we have deeper concerns about when a president is incapacitated, and it's not clear that John Kennedy should have been president of the United States given the many physical maladies that he had. So we're trying to get him to come to this symposium. We'll see what he has to say.
Yeah, I'm not so sure it's the maladies. I think it's the treatment of the maladies that is most disconcerting. The cortisone. We kind of think of Jack Kennedy as having sort of a full face and sort of a tan complexion.
That was the steroids.
It was the steroids he was taking that did that. And so, and amphetamines. He was on a lot of amphetamines, and so you really got to wonder about the level of medication that the President of the United States is on, and yet despite that makes some really heroic decisions, and we're going to talk about that, for example, at the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Now, when you and I were talking about this the other night, you said that at some point during this discussion, you thought it would be important to talk about the women. Do you want to do that at this moment?
No, it's up to you.
No, it's not.
Okay.
So
we do have to talk about that at some point.
Well, then now would have been the time. I mean, things that today would have probably precluded him from being the President of the United States. Just in just very general terms, try to describe how serious the issue of his womanizing was.
One biographer said that he had a pathological sexual compulsion. And everybody that was around him knew that, including Jackie. And so at some point, you have to admit that Jack Kennedy, well, now recently, some of you may have read, there's an intern that just wrote a book. Well, she was an intern in the White House, and she talks about her affair. And but it's just notorious, the fact that he did this womanizing, which was something that he inherited, I guess, that sort of level of womanizing he inherited from Joe Sr., and when Jackie, one of the biographers was saying that when Jackie married Jack, when the engagement was announced, one of Jack's friends went to Jackie and sat her down and said, "You need to understand. You need to understand that he will have women and he will continue to pursue women, and that's who Jack Kennedy is." So, and this was his friend that went to sort of warn Jackie that she had to accept that. And the biographer that I read said that she accepted that because that's the way her father was. And she just accepted the fact that that's the way the men are, that these powerful men are all going to be chasing women.
And that's what Rose Kennedy told her too, that's what great men do.
Yeah. So,
but I mean, we hear about Judith Exner and the German woman and so on. But when you read these biographies, it's hundreds of women, and the Secret Service are procuring for him, and he's meeting Marilyn Monroe in California during his trips there. I mean, some of this maybe one could discount, but the number of alleged relationships of a reckless sort that could have created a Monica Lewinsky issue or worse is in the scores and hundreds, not a handful. Mm-hmm. And he got away with it because we had a press that left him alone. Press was complicit in this. They knew about this. Ben Bradley, one of his closest friends, was an editor of the Washington Post and was quite complacent about all of this. But some of the things that Kennedy did were dangerous and reckless. And I won't say all the things he said about this, but he did once say that if he didn't have sex every day, he got headaches. So.
Let's tell the one story here that I think, and we're not Kennedy bashing here. This is just history. I think one of the things that I found most disturbing in reading biographies, getting ready for this, was that when Jackie was 8 months pregnant, after the Democratic convention, he left her alone and took off with his buddies, womanizing down in the south of France. And so they're out there on their yachts and they're women and they're drinking and they're partying, and then she has a stillborn child. And it's not Jack Kennedy that's at her bedside, it's Bobby. Bobby rushes to the hospital, Bobby spends time with her. Bobby gets a hold of Jack, and Jack doesn't even want to come home.
Doesn't come home.
And Bobby insists that he comes home. And finally, Bobby convinces him. So about, I think it's 3 or 5 days later, he finally comes home and to console Jackie at that point. But it's a terrible story about just a human.
So he wins the 1960 Democratic nomination, and then he wins the election. The election, this should give us some maybe anticipation of Tuesday night. He won by 112,881 votes out of nearly 70 million cast. He won by 0.2% of the popular vote. It was the narrowest election up until its time. Here he is with Bill Guy and Quentin Burdick in 1960, I believe. So his inaugural address. Let me just set this up. We have a clip. I did some research on, I'm fascinated by inaugural addresses. So I did a little research on this week. The shortest inaugural addresses in American history are as follows. George Washington, number 2, his second term, 135 words. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, his 4th inaugural address, just 559 words. Let me say of those two, I mean, George Washington, the father of his country, wins the war for us. He's the president of the Constitutional Convention. He's the president of the Society of the Cincinnati. He's the only unanimously chosen president in American history. He wants to retire after his first term. And Jefferson and Hamilton and others beg him to stay on to create the stability for the country. And so his second inaugural address in 1797 is the shortest in American history, and FDR's 4th one, which was March 4th, 1945, is the second shortest. FDR, we now know, was dying at the time that he delivered that second inaugural address, but both of them basically said the same thing. If you don't know me by now, it was just that simple. They didn't feel any need to go into detail because they had nothing left to explain to the American people. Interestingly, Lincoln's second inaugural address, maybe the greatest inaugural address in American history, was just short of 700 words. And I've done some analysis of this. I wrote an article for On Second Thought, the North Dakota Humanities magazine, about it a few years ago. There's hardly a 2-syllable word in the second inaugural address. I mean, Lincoln had maybe the best capacity for writing profound things in simple prose of any president in American history. And so he uses fewer than 700 words, and there's hardly a 2-syllable word in the whole second inaugural. An amazing achievement. Abraham Lincoln, 698. Theodore Roosevelt, you would have thought he would have given a 45,000-word inaugural address. Short, 985. And then John Kennedy, about half the length of the average. The average is about 2,600 words. John Kennedy's, which we'll look at now in a minute, is just 1,355. Here are the longest. William Henry Harrison.
Who lasted 30 days in office.
William Henry Harrison, 1841, delivers an inaugural address that took 1 hour and 42 minutes for him to read. It was a cold, drizzly, wintry day, and he died of pneumonia 30 days later. You know, I've used that. I thought of you when I read that, Larry, because beware of long-windedness. Yeah. Try to be brief, because you see what happens if you go on and on.
You guys all catch the irony here, right?
Oh, gee, they wouldn't have without that, Larry. William Howard Taft, TR's successor, 5433. I mean, an enormous inaugural address. James Polk, one-term president, 4776. Monroe, who would have thought? Almost 4,500 words. Benjamin Harrison, must run in the Harrison family, 4388. And Calvin Coolidge.
Who was called Silent Cal, by the way.
Yeah, but look at these. I mean, aside from Polk and Monroe, these are not upper tier presidents. So maybe the briefer you are, you know, think about that. And then the greatest inaugural addresses, in my opinion, this is just opinion now, but Lincoln's second, I think, is by far and away the greatest inaugural address in American history, with malice towards none, with charity towards all. An amazing piece of work. Jefferson's first. And Kennedy, by the way, wanted to be Jefferson. He said after his inaugural address that people were congratulating him. Truman heard it and said it was the best in American history. Other people were saying that it was worthy of the greatest orations that go back to Thucydides, the funeral oration of Pericles in the history of the Peloponnesian War. I mean, people were just overwhelmingly impressed by this piece of work. And Kennedy said to Jacqueline, I don't think it's as good as Jefferson's. You sort of think, well, there's a little hubris there. I mean, he's not Jefferson, but he was placing himself in the tradition of Thomas Jefferson. Franklin Roosevelt, his first in 1933. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And Ronald Reagan, his It's Morning in America Again inaugural in 1981. Okay, so let's show that clip.
Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans born in this century, tempered by war, disciplined by a hard and bitter peace, proud of our ancient heritage, and unwilling to witness or permit the slow undoing of those human rights to which this nation has always been committed and to which we are committed today at home and around the world. Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
So, Larry, in view of the time, I'm not going to do what I was going to do, which was to do a little rhetorical analysis of the first inaugural address, but let me just kind of summarize. It was written mostly by Theodore Sorensen, his great speechwriter, who also, by the way, wrote most of Profiles in Courage. Sorensen was from Nebraska. He was just a young man from Nebraska who had a flair for writing and got noticed, and he was lifted into this extraordinary position to be the speechwriter for one of the great speech makers of American history, and he went on to be a speechwriter for Robert Kennedy and for Ted Kennedy. If you remember what what Ted Kennedy said at the funeral of Robert Kennedy, that famous line, I'm sure you've all heard it. My brother need not be idealized, nor enlarged in death beyond what he was in life. He should be remembered as a good and decent man who saw wrong and tried to right it, who saw suffering and tried to heal it, who saw war and tried to stop it. Those of us who loved him and take him to his rest today pray that what he was for us and what he wished for others will someday come to pass for all the world. As he said many times in many parts of this country to those he touched and those who sought to touch him, some men see things as they are and say, why? I dream things that never were and say, why not? That is just quintessential Theodore Sorensen. And you hear those same cadences of chiasmus and antithesis and anaphora and parallelism in these series. Pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship in the first inaugural address. It's, in addition to being a really remarkable short inaugural address, filled with idealism, and the theme of it is sort of swords into plowshares. But in addition to all of that, it is rhetorically one of the most sophisticated of all inaugural addresses, and its only true rival in that regard is Jefferson's first. And so Sorensen was a master at this sort of thing. Kennedy played a big role in it. I'm not suggesting that. But Sorensen gave it that literary polish which you could hear in his speech with all those beautiful cadences and the rhythmic quality of it, which is mesmerizing.
And Sorensen was very young.
He was just a kid.
Just a kid from Nebraska.
And Sorensen has written several books on Kennedy, including a late memoir, which is fascinating. But here's what's so interesting about the first inaugural, the only inaugural address. Every time I say that, the first inaugural address, it just goes through me like a shot. Yeah. But here's what's so interesting about it. In 1,300 and some words, he never mentions a single domestic policy or program. It is 100% foreign policy. He thought he was going to make his name as the man who handled the Russians and wound down the Cold War to the satisfaction of the West. He doesn't say we're going to do this and that. If you read Barack Obama's first inaugural, or his inaugural, let's call it, it was heavily domestic, partly international. But John Kennedy was 100% international. Don't you find that interesting?
Well, that was his only interest. And when he was working on his graduate degree, that's all he cared about. He went to Europe, he traveled around Europe, he met with diplomats in Europe, and so his really only interest was foreign affairs. And when it looked like he was going to run for president, I think in '58, he actually got a position on the Foreign Affairs Committee in the Senate because that's all he cared about. And I think as you read about him, the one thing you find out is on the domestic issues that we think so much of Jack Kennedy about, he was really pulled into those issues by the times. The civil rights movement wasn't something that I think Jack Kennedy woke up one morning and said, oh, I'm going to be part of the civil rights movement. Rather, Martin Luther King and his colleagues were pulling the United States into the civil rights movement. And so Bobby and Jack then got involved in it because they were forced to. It was a part of their time.
Well, they had to choose. I mean, they were not, in 1958 and 9, John Kennedy was not particularly interested in civil rights. He always had the right instincts on civil rights. He always felt that black people were being mistreated and that the country was not living up to its ideals. And so he never wavered on that front. He was never a bigot in any sense. But it wasn't one of his causes. But then the civil rights movement really got underway during his first term, and he and his brother had to make a choice. Do we climb on board? And if we do, that's the right thing to do, but it's politically dangerous to do this. Or do we do nothing and just to show kind of benign neglect for it? Or do we align ourselves with the forces that want to keep African Americans in their place? And here's what I admire so much about John Kennedy. There are lots of things I don't admire about him, but this is what I do admire about him deeply. At his inaugural address, in his inaugural parade, he's in the viewing platform and he sees the Coast Guard band come by. You know, all the armed services sent their elite bands. And the Coast Guard band comes by and marches in front of him, and he turns to someone and says, "There's not a single Negro in that band." And so he issues an executive order immediately to integrate the Coast Guard Academy. That fast, because he knows he can do that. It doesn't require a congressional vote. There's no committee, there are no hearings, no one can stop him. And so he immediately, having seen this, does the right thing. You know, he doesn't pause for a second. He says, this is power I have, this is power I can use. It's not right that this can be an all-white band. And so that part of him, that capacity to have a core value system, and not particularly, he's very politically savvy. He didn't spend his political capital recklessly. He's not like a super liberal idealist. But when the moments came, when Martin Luther King came to him and said, you've got to get on board with this thing, they did. When Alabama needed to be integrated, they did. They sent freedom fighters to Selma and to Birmingham. And it cost him dearly. And he actually, one reason that he was in Texas in November of 1963 is that he was doing the math the way we've been doing it for the past 6 months, and he didn't think he could be reelected without Southern votes. And he was going to lose at this time, we have to remember that at this time, the South was dominated by the Democrats. Today it's dominated by the Republicans. That shift occurred during the 60s. So he needed some of the southern states to be reelected in 1964, and he felt that these things that he was doing in responding favorably to the civil rights movement would probably cost him votes and may cost him the election. And that's one reason why he insisted on going to Texas in 63 to try to, he was going to lose Texas, he thought, and try to bring it back into the Democratic fold. Yeah. Fascinating.
Well, before we move on to the Cold War, let's talk about, you brought up two issues there in that moment about the use of executive power and the political landscape. So let's talk a little bit about that before we go into the Cold War. By that I mean, we both know that he was very ineffective with the legislature, with Congress. He couldn't get anything passed, but he accomplished a lot in those 1,000 days. But he did it all by use of executive power.
Something that Theodore Roosevelt had done too, but Roosevelt was a master legislative handler and John Kennedy was not. And most people say that the reason for this, that he was so poor a legislative strategist, and really most of his major initiatives had stalled out and would not have been passed if it hadn't been for his martyrdom. But most historians and biographers say of this that he had been a lackluster representative and a worse senator. he was a no-show as a senator, on the road all the time, sick a bunch of the time, writing, speaking, grandstanding, but he had never done what his younger brother Theodore eventually did, which was master the Senate and learn how to use it and become a team player. And to go into what Rayburn said, to get along you have to go along, but you have to actually give yourself to the Senate in order to be able to use the Senate, and he never did. And so he becomes president in a sense too soon. One could say the same thing of Barack Obama, that they're presidents who became president too soon, and they hadn't yet mastered how to work with the legislature. And if you look at Obama's failures in the first term, or in the term that he's getting, his incapacity to work closely with Congress has been notorious, and people say the same thing, that he hadn't put in enough time in Congress to really know, to build the associations and the networks and to build the credibility and to do the tedious, boring work on the insurance bill or on the hog bill to win the kind of respect you need when the moment comes. So as vice president is one of the supreme masters of the Senate. So say
and it's completely neutralized.
And talk about what happens after his death.
He's completely neutralized by the fact that and there's a lot of theories about when Jack Kennedy offers to Johnson to be vice president. Jack Kennedy, and there's a lot of, I think, false stories about this. There's a couple things that are substantiated. One is that Jack Kennedy offers it to Lyndon Johnson and believes Lyndon Johnson is going to turn it down. Lyndon Johnson at that time is the most powerful man in the United States. He runs the Senate. Nothing's going to happen in Washington, D.C. that Lyndon Johnson doesn't sign up to. And he is the master of the Senate. There's no doubt about that. So Kennedy, the theory is, Kennedy thinks, well, I'll offer him the vice presidency. He'll turn it down because we all know the vice presidency is a non-job, and he'll turn it down. Instead, he accepts it. Well, then there's some real heartache because Bobby Kennedy keeps going to Johnson saying, withdraw your acceptance. That, Jack was just kidding here. He doesn't really want you. And then Lyndon Johnson gets really upset at Bobby Kennedy because he thinks Bobby Kennedy's trying to take him off the ticket, which he was. But, and that created a lot of hardship between the two of them. But at any rate, so Lyndon Johnson now becomes vice president of the United States and it is completely marginalized by the Kennedy people. Completely. At one point, Jack Kennedy, when they're putting these legislative packages together, Jack Kennedy says to Ted Sorensen, get with Lyndon and find out how to get this stuff passed. So Ted Sorensen reluctantly goes to LBJ, and LBJ is just elated now because finally they're asking him his opinion. So he tells him exactly how to get this legislation passed. And Ted Sorensen says, thank you, and leaves and never did one thing Lyndon Johnson told him to do. And so he's been completely marginalized. And a wonderful book that we've both read here by, and I really recommend it, Robert Caro, The Years of Lyndon Johnson, The Passage of Power. And I don't want to jump too far into the assassination here yet. But the reality is that Lyndon Johnson becomes President of the United States, and as master of the Senate, he knows how to break up the logjam that has stopped all of Kennedy's initiatives in the Senate, in Congress. And so Lyndon Johnson immediately gets on the phone, starts inviting senators into the Oval Office, and in a matter of weeks manages to move all of the legislation that Jack Kennedy had just sitting there. And as you mentioned, without his martyrdom, that probably would not have happened.
But in JFK's defense, some of his initiatives were being stalled by Southern committeemen. The committees were much more powerful and important in the 1960s than they are today. And Southern committeemen, almost all the chairs were Democrats from the South, and they had stranglehold on legislation. Anything that had a whiff of civil rights in it, they just stalled. And so Kennedy is being stalled out because he's proving to be too liberal on race issues for many of these very powerful Southerners. But Johnson is a Southerner, and he knows how to get around this. He knows how to, he can get a civil rights bill passed over the head or around a bigot because he's so incredibly canny about legislative strategy, and JFK never was. Fascinating.
Okay,
so
we'll jump back onto the script here.
So we have to remember that this all takes place in the context of the Cold War. And I wanted to just show you quickly, in his first inaugural address, one of the shortest in American history, there are 5 references to nuclear war. Think of that. This is the second sentence, for man holds in his mortal hands the power to abolish all forms of human poverty and all forms of human life. To those nations who would make themselves our adversary, we offer not a pledge but a request that both sides begin anew the quest for peace before the dark powers of destruction unleashed by science engulf all humanity. But neither can two great and powerful groups of nations take comfort from our present course, both sides overburdened by the cost of modern weapons, both rightly alarmed by the steady spread of the deadly atom, yet both racing to alter that uncertain balance of terror. Let both sides, for the first time, formulate serious and precise proposals for the inspection and control of arms, and bring the absolute power to destroy other nations under the absolute control of all nations. And finally, let both sides seek to invoke the wonders of science instead of its terrors. You know, that's pretty amazing that in an inaugural address that short, one dedicated fully to foreign policy, there are 5 significant references to nuclear war and nuclear terror. And another thing I think is so remarkable about John Kennedy is that he was a new generation. And he didn't accept the nuclearization of the world. He knew that was part of our arsenal. In fact, we were addicted to nuclear weapons by this time. But he thought that it had gone too far, and that mutually assured destruction was an insane idea, and that we had built our system to be too dependent on nuclear weapons. And he thought that a nuclear exchange was unthinkable. And because of that core conviction, he probably had the courage in 1962 in October to step back from the precipice. I mean, you tell me, but don't all historians say that the moment where we came closest to nuclear holocaust was 1962?
Absolutely. I think it's important to think about the difference between Eisenhower and Kennedy at this point. When Kennedy said the torch has been passed, it's not only to a younger generation, but I think that Kennedy had a real understanding of this new world, and I don't think Eisenhower did. Eisenhower, in his what was called New Look, believed that nuclear weapons were just another form of weapon. You could just get more bang for the buck. That if you put nuclear weapons on all the planes and on missiles and on ships and artillery shells, if you'd use nuclear weapons, you just got more bang. And that a nuclear weapon was just like any other weapon. And because of that, this country, you said the term addicted, we were addicted to nuclear weapons. We had entire squadrons of airplanes, for example, where every weapon they had was a nuclear weapon. We had army units in Europe where all their artillery shells were nuclear artillery shells. They weren't using conventional weapons. And when we get into the Cuban Missile Crisis,
we better do it here too.
We better do that here pretty soon. But at any rate, my point is to say that when the torch was passed to Jack Kennedy, along with the passing of that torch was a real understanding of what a nuclear weapon was. It wasn't just more bang for the buck. It was something that could destroy humanity, and that's what he says in his inaugural address. And Jack Kennedy understood that. Eisenhower didn't, had probably a passing understanding of that, but just believed as a military guy that you can win a war, and the nuclear weapon just gave us an advantage to do that. When you think about the World War II generals that MacArthur in Korea talked about using nuclear weapons, wanted to use nuclear weapons.
He wanted to pave a 10-mile zone through Korea with them.
Would just bomb all this with nuclear weapons. So they saw a nuclear weapon as just another weapon, which it's not. And Jack Kennedy recognized that. And so he's really obsessed with this idea that we've somehow got to get this whole unleashed genie back into the bottle. And that's what he spends his presidency trying to do.
And he makes it clear in the first inaugural address, swords into plowshares. Really, there are 4 Cold War concerns, I think, for the Kennedy administration. Number 1 is the nuclear arms race. And remember that Kennedy campaigned in 1960 saying there was a missile gap. He knew that wasn't true, and the McNamara immediately admitted it. McNamara was the Secretary of Defense once they came to power. We now know that we had a 17-to-1 advantage over the Soviets in missiles and in nuclear warheads. 17-to-1. And during the campaign, Kennedy was saying, they're ahead of us, we got to catch up. Yeah. The Eisenhower administration has been spineless in not keeping up. He wasn't lying exactly, but he certainly was making political hay out of nothing. Right. So that was one thing, the nuclear arms race. Second thing was Berlin. The partition of Germany after World War II and the Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe had put enormous pressure on Berlin, and the Soviets wanted us to leave Berlin and leave because it's in East Germany, and I think they had a point to make that it was their zone and we should leave and leave the city to them, which we refused to do. And a lot of the Kennedy's administration is focused on the Berlin question. The third question is the colonial question. What do we do about Vietnam and Laos and Southeast Asia and Africa? And Kennedy looks at that in the first inaugural address and says, really interestingly, the United States has to be on the side of these colonial liberation movements. But we aren't doing it just because we're in a Cold War. We have to do it for the right reasons, which is we believe people have the right to self-determination. And then the fourth issue in this period is Cuba. And Cuba was a gigantic issue because Cuba had Castro had installed himself in 1959, just before Kennedy becomes president. In early 1960, Castro and the Cubans aligned themselves formally with the Soviet Union. So this is the big irritant of the Kennedy administration, and depending on which conspiracy theory you hold, it probably percolates all the way up to the assassination. But I think it's fair to say the Kennedy administration was obsessed with Cuba and not losing Cuba. And in the inaugural address, Kennedy says he is reaffirming the Monroe Doctrine. James Monroe in 1823 said the Western Hemisphere, as it now becomes liberated from Spanish colonial rule and Portuguese, cannot be recolonized by any European nation. The Monroe Doctrine says the Western Hemisphere belongs to us, the people of the Western Hemisphere, and the Europeans are never allowed to interfere. In 1905, Theodore Roosevelt creates the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, and now in 1961, Kennedy reaffirms the Monroe Doctrine and says the Western Hemisphere is not going to be a plaything for others, and by which he means the Soviet Union. Yeah. That's right.
Eventually, I think we're going to get to Vietnam. I don't know where.
I told you.
Yeah. But I think it's really fair to say we think of the 60s, we think of Vietnam, but if you had asked Jack Kennedy what the two issues were that kept him awake at night, it's Berlin and Cuba, because he believed that either one of them could throw us into World War III.
And one nearly did.
And one nearly did. Okay.
So Berlin crisis. So we have this tape. So eventually what happens is the Soviets build the Berlin Wall. And Kennedy actually saw it as good, right?
This is a positive because it solved this problem. And just, I think we probably need to lay out Berlin. You know, at the end of World War II, Berlin, that sits in the center of what was called East Germany,
the GDR,
is now occupied and by sectors. There's what we call East Berlin, which was occupied by the Soviets, and then West Berlin, there's a US sector, a French sector, and an English sector. And so there, at this time, up until John Kennedy, there's a lot of movement going back and forth between that. There's a lot of people are escaping the East by running into West and being flown out, and there's all sorts of things going on. And so Jack Kennedy believes that somehow the Soviets could roll in with tanks into West Berlin, and that would start a war.
Oh, World War III.
World War III. And so but then when the wall was thrown up for Jack Kennedy, it stabilized it. He said, wow, this is a great solution. They've walled us off, and actually what they're doing is they're walling off their own people from going into West Berlin.
But they're basically affirming the partition by walling it off. Yeah. So it solves the problem temporarily. But then he gives maybe the most famous speech of his presidency.
We're going to get there.
We have a clip of it right now.
And when one man is enslaved, all are not free. When all are free, then we look forward to that day when this city will be joined as one, and this country and this great continent of Europe in a peaceful and hopeful globe. When that day finally comes, as it will, the people of West Berlin can take sober satisfaction in the fact that they were in the front lines for almost 2 decades. All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the word, Ich bin ein Berliner.
It's a great clip.
So we're not giving that much time, but so let's go to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Go ahead. This is sort of your area.
I don't. Well, I don't know where to start with the Cuban Missile Crisis, other than the fact that in October
They have a handout.
Yeah. Oh, you've got a timeline.
There's a timeline.
Oh, let's
yeah.
okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, where should we start? In October?
Well, it started October 14th.
October 14th. So the United States finds out that the Soviets are putting offensive nuclear missiles in Cuba that, do we have that picture of the map? Probably not. Okay. That could clearly hit the United States. The southern United States, Washington, D.C., all the way up into sort of the Northeast. And so the United States now has to figure out what they're going to do about it. And this is where it really becomes touchy, because in fact, we were talking right before we started here about, here we've got this young president who doesn't have a lot of respect for the generals and the admirals, and we got a bunch of generals and admirals who don't have much respect for this young president. Okay. And now we're entering a real crisis. We have got the Soviet Union. They are violating the Monroe Doctrine. They're setting offensive weapons in Cuba. We don't like Castro. He's a communist. What are we going to do about that? And so the military has these fabulous plans that, well, we can take them out surgically. We can bomb. You know, we have to take the first step. And as president, they're telling Jack Kennedy, you'll be seen as weak if you don't take this step. And if we don't attack Cuba. There's a couple of folks in the room that I think common sense is prevailing. Bobby Kennedy says that runs against our tradition. We just don't attack. In fact, Bobby Kennedy at one point during these discussions by all the generals and admirals how they can attack Cuba and they can knock all these sites out and they can do all this, he writes down and passes to one of the cabinet secretaries that he knows what the Japanese felt like planning Pearl Harbor. And so Bobby Kennedy is counseling Jack not to do this, and Jack is telling folks, okay, well, get together, think some more about it. He would leave, and the next day we'll talk about it again. So how many remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? There, particularly people that were down in Florida and down there, the duck and cover exercises and all that sort of stuff is going on. So that's what's happening. But what I find most interesting is the United States military response to this. And that is where the defense condition called DEFCON is ratcheted up. DEFCON 4 is normal. We take the U.S. nuclear forces to DEFCON 2, which means that you're on alert. DEFCON 1 is actually going to war. So the DEFCON level goes from 4 to 2 very quickly, and the United States is preparing to go to war. Tens of thousands of reservists are called up. Southern Florida becomes basically an armed camp. And one of the documents that I found most interesting in this is that telegram. You all have a copy of a telegram, and let me just kind of explain what this telegram is saying. This is from the commander of the U.S. Continental Command. And he's sending this, and you can see all the people that are infoed there, and I won't run through all of them, but the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the director of the Joint Staff, J4 and J5. J5 is the planning division in the Pentagon. J4 is the logistics guys. Anyway, there's a whole list of folks, the Army, the Navy, the White House. So he's sending this, and he's talking about the rules of engagement in the Florida area. Now, this is as this whole thing is cranking up. This is on the 27th of October. What he's saying is that the rules of engagement in Florida say that I can use high explosive weapons only. Okay. I can use high explosive, those would be conventional weapons. Saying that's what the rules of engagement are saying. But now down at the bottom where it says reference A and B, he says, authorize me as the commander to employ nuclear weapons in air defense within the sovereign boundaries of the United States, its territories, and possessions. Think about that. The commander of the United States Continental Command is asking for permission to employ nuclear weapons within territory of the United States. Now, why is he asking that? You flip to the next side. The very last sentence. Your attention invited to the fact that in most locations, Nike Hercules units, that's surface-to-air missiles, have no, repeat, no high explosive warheads. So the plans are saying in defense of Florida, you can only use conventional weapons, high explosives. But because of the new look during the Eisenhower administration, all these units have been deployed with nuclear weapons. That's all they have. So if the Soviets and the Cubans were to invade, and that was one of the concerns, that they're going to fly across to Florida and invade, the only option the commander on the ground had was nuclear weapons. Now, here's one quick story about this, because the same was true up in Alaska. And so during the Cuban Missile Crisis, one of the U-2s flying up out of Alaska is flying up along the boundary of the Soviet Union. We're spying on each other. We all know that that's going on. But this U-2, which is a spy plane, flies into Soviet airspace. So once the U-2 flies into Soviet airspace, the pilot's going, oh no, I got to get out of here. MiGs have scrambled, that's Soviet fighters, have scrambled on this U-2. So the U-2 pilot is in contact with the Strategic Air Command, and he says that MiGs have scrambled, I'm in Soviet airspace, I'm flying out, I need some help here. So SAC contacts the air base in Alaska and sends 2 fighters out to help escort this U-2 back. The problem is that the 2 fighters that they sent, the only weapons on them are nuclear. That's all they've got. So think of how close we got to a nuclear exchange had they gotten them. We're shooting each other's airplanes down. An American U-2 has been shot down. Do you have that on your timeline?
Yes, it's later. It's late in the game. I think it's the 26th or 7th.
October 27th, which is the same day that this telegram is sent. Okay, so a U-2, a spy plane, is shot down over Cuba and a pilot's killed.
He's the only casualty of the
whole thing.
Cuban Missile Crisis.
So up in Alaska, we've got fighters going out to intercept Soviet MiGs that are chasing after an American U-2, and the only way they can respond to them is with nuclear force. That's how dangerous it was. We focus a lot on the missiles that were being put in Cuba for understandable reasons, but what you have are 2 huge military machines, one Soviet and one American, that are gearing up for war, and the chances of any misfire would have caused an exchange of nuclear weapons.
And in fact, some of the field commanders on both sides have the right to respond if there is a provocation that can't go up the chain. So it could have happened that if, let's say, the Cubans had sent their little limited air force into Florida airspace, we might have scrambled, we might have shot them down because that was the only ordnance we had, and suddenly a nuclear weapon has gone off and the things begin to ratchet up very rapidly. So we had made some mistakes by over-committing ourselves to nuclear options as tactical weapons and air-to-surface and air-to-air weapons. But it gets worse, as you know. And it sounds like we're beating up on the military, and I don't want to do that at all, because it may be that if a different sort of president had pursued a more military option, the Soviets would have backed down. I mean, we don't know. We presume that John Kennedy saved the world, but we don't know what those scenarios would have been. But here's what we do know, that at the same time that this was happening, several of our fail-safe planes, we were sending, at this time we had B-52s and other bombers in the air 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, so that between a quarter and a third of our nuclear arsenal was always in the air, so that the Soviets couldn't attack our air command bases, because there would always be enough in the air to penetrate Soviet airspace. And they would reach a fail-safe point somewhere in the Arctic, and then they would be called back. And this happened for, I don't know how long, 15 or 20 years. At least once during the Cuban Missile Crisis, our B-52s went beyond the fail-safe point, just to play with it a little. And think of that, the brinksmanship of that. Just testing, seeing what the response would be. And as you know, there was a missile fired from an air base in Vandenberg Air Base in California. So we fired a
test missile.
A test missile with no nuclear weapon on it,
Right.
but deep into the Pacific.
Right.
During the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Russians could have assumed that that was the beginning of World War III. They had no way of knowing that there was nothing on top of that missile. They had the capacity to detect that missile going off. So all of these either accidents or provocations around the edges are occurring when the president and his team of 13 are just trying to keep the lid on this thing, and any one of these could have triggered World War III.
Any one of them.
What year is this, please?
62.
62. I think the point we need to get to is how it got de-escalated then. And it's really between Khrushchev and Jack Kennedy, there's an exchange of letters. And probably most importantly, it was Khrushchev sent a letter that said that the United States had to pledge no invasion of Cuba.
Ever.
Ever. The United States would not invade Cuba.
If you would do that.
And if you do that, we'll remove our weapons. That was the proposal from Khrushchev, and John Kennedy did not respond to that right away. Then that was followed up by a second letter that said, and not only do you have to not invade, but you have to withdraw your missiles from Turkey, because we had nuclear-tipped missiles in Turkey at the time. So Kennedy very wisely chooses not even to respond to the second letter, he responds to the first letter. And in the response to the first letter, he says, okay, we'll make that pledge. And in the meantime, Bobby Kennedy has gone out to meet with the Soviet ambassador, and there were some intermediaries there, and said, look, if you don't say anything to anybody, we will pull our missiles out of Turkey. And the reality was they were already planned. There was a deactivation of those already planned. But then they made that promise, but that promise was not public. In fact, it was many years before the American public found out that we had, in fact, exchanged missiles in Cuba for missiles in Turkey.
And then just one little piece of this that's so horrible. So we actually floated the idea of the Jupiter missiles being pulled from Turkey before the Soviets ever brought it up. The Kennedy brothers, this is the way the historians now think it happened, planted a leak with Joseph Alsop, who was a Kennedy columnist in Washington, D.C., and Alsop in his column said, well, maybe the way to solve this thing is not just the quid pro quo, they'll pull the missiles if you agree not to invade. Maybe we could agree to pull our 15 Jupiter missiles out of Turkey because they're on the underbelly of the Soviet Union, just as these missiles would be on the underbelly of the United States. The minute that Alsop published that, the Kennedys publicly rebuked it and said, this is not in our planning. They'd planted this story. So then Bobby Kennedy eventually goes to see the Soviet ambassador in Washington, D.C., and says just what you said. Look, the deal is the quid pro quo about invasion, but if you understand what I'm saying, within a few months, we'll quietly remove those Jupiter missiles from Turkey, but you can never say there was linkage, because if you do, the deal's off. So the Soviets then agreed to this. Well, here's the horrible part of it, Larry. Adlai Stevenson was our ambassador to the UN, and he was a true bleeding heart Eleanor Roosevelt liberal. And he'd been in the XCOM through all these 13 awful days, and he'd been the one counseling peace and concessions and negotiation. So once the thing is resolved at the end of October, there was a kind of a quasi-official account that was going to appear in a major American magazine, and the Kennedys helped to write it, Robert and John, and they threw Stevenson under the bus and said the whole thing about the missiles had come from him. And he never forgave them because it hadn't been his idea. And the Kennedys wanted to keep themselves, their reputation as the tough guys in the Cuban Missile Crisis, not the conciliators. And so they threw Stevenson under the bus, and he found out what they had done. And it broke his heart that he had been this good player, and they just deliberately, for purely ruthless, selfish purposes, fingered him for a proposal that actually came from the two of them. And that's the dark side of the Kennedys.
We're going to have to.
There's a famous photo from the Cuban Missile Crisis. Go ahead. Let's just play that clip.
Let's play that clip.
The Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. Only last Thursday, as evidence of this rapid offensive buildup was already in my hand, Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko told me in my office that he was instructed to make it clear once again, as he said his government had already done, that Soviet assistance to Cuba, and I quote, pursued solely the purpose of contributing to the defense capabilities of Cuba, unquote. That, and I quote him, training by Soviet specialists of Cuban nationals in handling defensive armaments was by no means offensive. And that if it were otherwise, Mr. Gromyko went on, the Soviet government would never become involved in rendering such assistance, unquote. That statement also was false. Acting therefore in the defense of our own security and of the entire Western Hemisphere, and under the authority entrusted to me by the Constitution, as endorsed by the resolution of the Congress, I have directed that the following initial steps be taken immediately. To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, will, if found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. I call upon Chairman Khrushchev to halt and eliminate this clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat to world peace and to stable relations between our two nations. I call upon him further to abandon this course of world domination and to join in an historic effort to end the perilous arms race and to transform the history of man. Our goal is not the victory of might, but the vindication of right. Not peace at the expense of freedom, but both peace and freedom here in this hemisphere, and we hope around the world. God willing, that goal will be achieved.
It's an amazing speech, and the use of the word quarantine was very deliberate here. Soviet ships are coming to Cuba, they've got missiles on them, and so the United States is going to impose a quarantine. And he said that instead of blockade, because a blockade could be considered an act of war.
Under international law it was, and so they fudged, because no one knew what a quarantine meant except that it was a blockade by other names.
And it worked. And so this speech, tied to those letters that we were just talking about then, diffused the whole situation. And it is remarkable to think this happened in October of '62. Keeping in mind, back to your timeline, in April of '61, the Bay of Pigs fiasco. In June of '61, Khrushchev treats Jack Kennedy like a teenager and shakes his finger in his face and berates him, and Jack Kennedy says the worst time of his life was having to meet with Cuba in Vienna.
With Khrushchev, yeah.
Or Khrushchev, I'm sorry. Khrushchev in Vienna. And now in October of '62, he stands up and he does exactly what he had to do at that time.
And then Dean Rusk, who was the Secretary of State, famously said when the resolution came, we stood eyeball to eyeball and the other guy blinked. But it was a standoff between the West and the East and the United States and the Soviet Union. And I mean, there was no reason to believe that the Soviets would back down. And if they hadn't, then we would have had to take out those sites, and that could have led to a ratcheting up towards nuclear war. I mean, it was the closest we've ever come. We came a hair's breadth from nuclear exchange. We went to DEFCON 3, which is, it doesn't happen very often. No, well, two, that's not higher.
Yep.
And how often have we gone to DEFCON 2?
Not too often. I don't know what the answer is.
Okay, good. So Dallas, well, Vietnam, go ahead. You were going to talk.
Oh, before Dallas?
Yeah, because that Dallas is the end.
Dallas is the end, okay. Just very quickly, Clay, as you know, there's a lot of speculation about had Kennedy lived, would we have been in Vietnam? And there's a lot of folks that talk about Kennedy had said that I will pull out of Vietnam, but I can't do it until after November of '64.
Which he said.
Well, because of the election in '64, and he didn't want to be another American president like Truman, who lost China. Whoever's going to lose Vietnam is going to get tagged with that. And so, and then there were plans too. During 1963, there were actually plans designed for the United States to go from 15,000 troops in Vietnam down to 1,000 by the end of '64. This was a well-laid plan. But in the meantime, the other thing that's happened is President Diem of South Vietnam, who is a Roman Catholic in a Buddhist country, President Diem and his government are incredibly corrupt. And every American that goes there to visit them, finds out how corrupt they are. One report came back and said that Diem spends more in the defense of his own administration than he does in defense of the country. And so in August of '63, Kennedy gives his approval to a coup by Vietnamese generals against Diem. And that happens on November 2nd of, think about this, November 2nd of 1963. Diem is overthrown. He and his brother escape to a Catholic church. They're found there. They're hauled out to a truck, and in the back of the truck, they're executed, assassinated. So Jack Kennedy is now informed that, the coup, and Jack Kennedy, when he approved the coup, thought, well, then that means Diem's going to go to exile in France or exile in Switzerland or something like this. He never expected that that exile was going to be an assassination, or excuse me, that coup would end in assassination. So now, what happens after Diem is assassinated is the ineptitude of the generals that now take over. And everything that I've read tells me that the plan to withdraw that was developed in early '63 and that we would be out by '64 completely falls apart after the assassination of Diem. And then 20 days later, with the assassination of President Kennedy, everything is just frozen, put on hold, waiting for Lyndon Johnson to decide what he's going to do about Vietnam. And so what happens from what happens on the 2nd of November and the 22nd of November in '63, I think, is what resulted in what we know about the Vietnam War. We were going to end up in the Vietnam War, a prolonged Vietnam War after Diem's assassination, and that was put in concrete with the assassination of Kennedy on 22nd. What do you think?
I don't know. I mean, are you or are you not? You know, there's a famous debate about what Kennedy would have done had he lived and had he been reelected. And if you've seen the Oliver Stone movie, the basis of the conspiracy comes from this, that John Kennedy was going to wind down the war in Vietnam. He had stood up to the generals and the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that this disillusionment that he had with American engagement was one of the things, say Oliver Stone and others, that led to a conspiracy to kill him. Leaving that out, are you saying that if he had been reelected, he was likely to have wound down the war?
No, I said just the opposite.
Because of the Diem thing, he couldn't.
That's
right.
He
had become a prisoner of his own
exactly
Cold War activities.
I think because Kennedy agreed to the coup against Diem, that the events of the next 10 years were pretty well laid in stone.
But many Kennedy admirers and virtually all liberals have believed that if he had lived, he would have wound down the war, and Johnson misunderstood where he was on the war because Johnson had been kept out of the loop. Johnson famously said, I'm not going to be the first president to lose a war. And so Johnson misunderstood the Kennedy legacy and took us into the quagmire and the nightmare when JFK wouldn't have done that. Right. You're not buying that.
No, and the beauty of history is we'll never know. So let's go to Dallas.
Well, one hates to go. We'll wrap up here.
Yeah, we're going to have to wrap up. I think we got a microphone back here, so we're going to go to questions.
Let's just have a couple of photographs. We don't have time to go into this, except these are photographs of Clint Hill, and the reason I have them, if you go back to that handout or the save the date card, next November, we're going to have this incredible symposium here with the State Historical Society and the Dakota Institute and BSC. And our keynote is Clint Hill, who's a North Dakotan. And I just read his book yesterday. It's a heartbreaking book, Mrs. Kennedy and Me. And he talks about these 6 seconds. And so I just got several pictures of the assassination.
That is him on the back of the limousine.
That's him climbing up after the president has been killed. You can see Jacqueline Kennedy beginning to come back onto the back of the limousine, and he then rushed from the car behind. There's a car behind that has to stay within 5 feet of the presidential limousine at all times. So think how close he was. When the first shot rings out, he sees the president clutching his throat. He realizes that something's wrong, so they're going 5 or 6 miles per hour now. He leaps off of the chase car and sprints up to the back of this car. And here, there is a stepping, on each side there's a step for the Secret Service men, and there are handles up on the trunk. And so he leaps up here to try to save the president's life. Well, meanwhile, as he's running from the chase car to the lead car, the president is killed. The bullet that explodes the back of his head takes place, and Clint Hill is spattered with blood and tissue. So now he sees Jacqueline Kennedy in her panic, out of sheer instinct, climbing back onto the trunk, and he throws himself, as the car is speeding up to go to the hospital, he throws himself onto the trunk and pushes her back into the back seat of the car, and he certainly saves her from bodily harm, arguably saves her life. So there he is. Here he is in this other photo, the color photo, back here. This is the car that has to stay within 5 feet of the limousine at all times. Here's the president just moments before he's killed. Governor Connolly, Jacqueline Kennedy, Mrs. Connolly would be here. Secret Service man here, Secret Service driver here. This is the second car, and there's Clint Hill in his sunglasses, walking along or riding on the rail there to try to stay up. And then finally, this is of course this appalling image that you have to look at from the Zapruder film of her. This is the dead president. Here's Mrs. Kennedy beginning to climb, and you see here Clint Hill makes his appearance to intervene and do what he can for Jacqueline Kennedy. Well, it's such a great thing that we're going to have him here to give the keynote. He's giving 2 talks, Larry. He's giving this talk about those 6 seconds. And then he's giving a talk the next day about a book that he's about to publish of photographs of the Kennedy administration. He was always right there. He was Jacqueline Kennedy's Secret Service man. And so he can tell you what's going on in many of the most famous photographs of Camelot, because he was just out of the picture or cropped out after the photographs were taken. So do you want to say anything about the assassination? No. Here's Clint Hill. Go ahead. There's the Warren report. So let me just tell you what's going to be at this symposium very quickly. Here's what you can expect. Clint Hill for the keynote, 2 lectures. An exhibit at the Heritage Center. Kimberly Jondahl is putting together an exhibit of their materials, newspapers and photographs and other materials relating to John Kennedy's visits to North Dakota particularly, and North Dakota newspaper and other response to his assassination. Bismarck Band and Symphony, Dr. Beverly Everett is going to be conducting on the 4th floor a special symphony on this issue with music that was either favorites of John Kennedy's or music that was commissioned
for this symposium.
Well, commissioned after his death or at the funeral, but then we're also commissioning a piece for this. I'll give a talk on Eric Sevareid and the Kennedys. Kim Jondahl is going to give a lecture on JFK and North Dakota. We'll have lectures on the Cold War, style and fashion in the Kennedy White House, including the famous renovation of the White House, the Kennedys and the arts. Craig Nelson, I think, is coming back to talk about the Kennedys and the space program. We'll have a full session on exactly what transpired second by second on November 22nd. We'll have a couple of people here to talk about the Warren Commission, and you know, I think something like 78% of the American people believe the Warren Commission did not tell the truth. A panel on conspiracy theories, a film festival for 5 or 6 weeks beforehand at the new auditorium of the Heritage Center. Films like Oliver Stone's JFK, but also Dr. Strangelove, Failsafe, the film about the PT-109, starring Jack Robertson, but a whole series of films. A book club, we'll have a series of books that you can buy at Barnes & Noble or on Amazon or anywhere else, and you'll be able to follow along as we prepare for this. So it's going to be, there I went again, it's going to be an amazing, that's it anyway, but that's going to be an amazing symposium.
Lyndon Johnson. Yeah.
Oh, then finally, a Lyndon Johnson lecture. We're hoping to get Robert Caro, the author of that amazing new biography. Here are his visits to North Dakota, 1958, 1960, 1960, 1960, and 1963. That's it.
I think that's it. Okay. We have a microphone. If you have a question, please wait till Robin gets you the microphone, because we're taping this, and you can see all these lectures if sitting in here hasn't been too onerous. You can see all of these conversations that we have on cable access. They're all taped and they're on demand. So
they're on demand?
They're on demand. You can go on their website.
How's the demand?
And I don't know.
That's very
Do we have any questions? We have a microphone up here.
Just a couple, and we're probably way out of time today.
No, I think we're
right?
we're about question time.
Okay.
Yeah. No questions? Oh, we got a question over here, Robin. The mic coming right over.
First of all, I'd like to say you've done a wonderful job with 3.5 years of a very complicated time in our country's history. I do, however, am puzzled by your statements calling JFK or a reference to him as his martyrdom. Would you please explain that?
You did it.
Yes, I did. Well, I mean, if I walk out on the street this afternoon and shoot somebody, that's a killing or a murder. But when you kill somebody of political importance or of great social leadership, that's an assassination. And that's a difficult distinction right there. Some people agree on some of these terms and not on others. But when John Kennedy was killed, his legislative agenda was stalled. His achievements were actually pretty meager up till that point. It wasn't clear that he would be reelected. But once he was killed, he suddenly became one of the most popular presidents in American history. A whole world sprang up around him. More books, documentaries, films, exhibits have been made for him than almost any president of the 20th century. And because he was killed, most biographers believe Lyndon Johnson was able to force Southern obstructionists into passing the monumental civil rights laws of 1964 and 1965. And most of these biographers say that those bills could not have passed if there hadn't been the assassination of a now beloved figure in American history. So that's why I use martyrdom, in the sense that with figures who are martyred, and I think Martin Luther King was another one, this often leads to a national spasm of sympathy, guilt, high-mindedness, a willingness to look at Commonwealth questions and not just look at local political questions. And so that's the sense. Maybe that's a loose term, but I think that, do you agree that the liberal, well, not the liberal, the civil rights agenda of the Kennedy administration might not have passed without his death?
Not at that time.
Not at that time,
I
right.
think eventually, I think it was just a matter of time, but yeah. Any other questions? There's a question down here.
Lots of questions.
Lots of questions now.
First of all, thank you for a wonderful conversation. It's been very interesting to me, and I'm sure everybody else. This is a tough question. In your opinions, or with presidential scholars, had Kennedy not been assassinated, had the myth of Camelot never been, how would he have been rated as a president that maybe had, I know this is impossible, but you know, the womanizing has come out, some of the
illnesses.
The glamour's rubbed off a little bit. I mean, it's an impossible question, but had he lived, how would he have been rated with modern presidents?
You know, actually, it's a counterfactual question, of course, and let me just say this. Abraham Lincoln was a great president, and he was martyred at the end of the Civil War. He had tremendous accomplishments during his time. He saved the Union. You know, the scourge of slavery in the United States was eliminated because of his insistence that we stay as a union and not divide this continent, this great continent, into two different countries, one free and one slave. I mean, he did marvelous things, and he's martyred. I'm not so sure that had Jack Kennedy been killed, assassinated 1,000 days into his presidency, that people could sit back and say all those wonderful things he accomplished. His accomplishments are really after his death, as Clay's already talked about, with Lyndon Johnson being the master of the Senate and being able to get all these things through. So his accomplishments really come after his death. So it's very difficult to say. I don't think without, as Clay just said, without his assassination, I don't think the civil rights agenda, for example, would have passed then. I think eventually it would have passed, but it wouldn't have passed then. Would have been during his presidency? I don't know. But counterfactually, had he not been assassinated, he certainly would not be in the pantheon that he's in today. The assassination put him in the pantheon.
You know, let me just say, first of all, where Camelot comes from. Camelot was not used during the Kennedy administration. After his death, I think 1 week later, Mrs. Kennedy had a long interview with Theodore White. And if you remember Theodore White, he wrote The Making of the President 1960, 1964, 1968, all the way through 1972. And she had an interview with him, and towards the end of the interview, she said, you know, Jack's favorite music came from the musical Camelot, One Brief Shining Moment, and so on. And so this instantly created the Camelot myth. And Kennedy aides like Kenneth O'Donnell and Theodore Sorensen said if Jack had lived, he would have hated that. That he was a very detached, ironic, not a sentimental figure at all, and that he would have been upset with her sentimentalizing the administration with the term Camelot. We don't know, but I think one thing one could say in answer to that question is that there are two types of presidents, those who diminish in office and those who grow in office. Most presidents diminish in office, but Jefferson diminished in office, for example. Madison diminished in office.
What do you mean by diminished in office?
That they lost their energy, they didn't learn from their mistakes, that they were pretty much the same coming out that they were coming in. But some presidents grow in office. Lincoln famously grew in office, maybe the greatest example. Truman grew in office. And I think John Kennedy grew in office, that by the time he's in November of 1963, he's more confident, he's starting to hit his stride, those early mistakes he's learned from, not just been diminished by. I mean, my own opinion, it's very early, but I think Barack Obama has been diminished in office so far. But I think that some presidents just find it debilitating and it wears them down. But some presidents seem to grow greater. And I think there were signs that Kennedy was becoming a better president of the United States, not a worse one, towards the end of his first term. But there's no way we can possibly know. What we do know is that when you do these polls, historians rank Kennedy in the second tier and maybe third tier of American presidents typically. But the public ranks him in the top tier of American presidents because of the elegance, the glamour, the wit, the beauty, the idealism, and the fact that it was the 60s with this, you know, the space program, the technological boom of the 60s, the great economic boom of that period. But here's something that Henry Fairley says. Henry Fairley is a British scholar who wrote a book called The Kennedy Promise way back in the 70s, and I just reread it. It's a brilliant book. He says that all that talk about bear any burden, pay any price, long twilight struggle, and all that stuff in the first inaugural set the bar so high that no president could ever actually live up to that wild set of promises and expectations. And so there was going to be a disillusionment when we realized that the country was not going to be that country, that we were just a great country, but we weren't going to be that great a country. And so in that sense, and I say this very delicately, but in that sense, it's fortunate that John Kennedy didn't live to inherit that disillusionment. The disillusionment was all thrown at his hapless successor, Lyndon Johnson, and he paid the price for all of that idealism when Kennedy there would have probably been a disillusionment with Kennedy as the race riots of the 60s came and as the war on poverty stalled out. And we may disagree about Vietnam, but Vietnam, I think, would have been a quagmire no matter what.
Mm-hmm. Is there another question on it?
Thank you for your time. My mom's boss was Sergeant Shriver. Didn't Kennedy have some part to play in the Peace Corps?
Oh, that goes back to the executive power we were talking about, and Clay may want to address this more, but Kennedy could not have created the Peace Corps if he had waited on Congress. And so he just created it by fiat.
March 1st, 1961, executive order, and then he got Congress to pay for it. But he started it before Congress could object.
Yeah.
Sergeant
But it's
Shriver was his
amazing.
brother-in-law, and there's a new biography of Sergeant Shriver, which is really a positive one.
Yeah.
I think maybe that's it.
I think we got time for one more question back
over
here,
here.
if we can, and then I think we turn into pumpkins. Yes, very soon.
You said that the president had some witty comment at the UND speech. I don't think you gave us that.
Right. Let me see if I can remember what he said. So he's at UND, and the speech he gave there was extremely good. And by the way, the Historical Society has it, and it'll be part of a continuous loop in their exhibit and also at our symposium. But he said, he was talking about the glories of higher education. And what is it exactly he said? He said, for example, I was able, thanks to politics, to go from being a junior lieutenant in the Navy to the commander-in-chief without ever going up through the ranks. This is the value of political education. But he said it better than that, but it was a very remarkable thing. Let me see if I can find it while you, go ahead. I thought you'd say some nice, interesting things.
Some witty thing.
Some witticisms.
Okay. We'll take one more question while Clay's looking for this.
Oh yeah, great.
Is there any more questions? Oh, we do have down here. I really appreciate all of you coming out today, and I hope that you'll join us next fall, next November, when we have the symposium. I think it's just going to be, like Clay said, world class.
Yeah, was there a comment?
There's a
Yeah,
comment.
well, the comment I had was, in some of my readings, it was noted that, speaking of health issues, that Kennedy always wore a large back brace.
Right.
You know, maybe a foot in. And when he was, the first shot went through his head, but it wasn't the one that killed him. But because of the back brace, his body wasn't able to fold over.
Yeah.
And be down further, and then the second shot was able to be made. And you can see if you watch the video, he bends, but he only bends a very little. And they said that was due to that back brace. And so you kind of think of all the other little coincidences that take place with him and because of his health.
Yeah. I've heard that same thing, that sort of corset that he wore all the time because of his bad back. Doc, would that make sense to you? You're a medical doctor. Does that make sense, that corset that he was wearing? And
exactly. Yes. I was wondering, though, all this.
give him the mic, please.
Did anything come of all the investigations that were made about Henry Lee Oswald and so forth?
My view on this is that the Warren Commission, this is, everybody's
Go ahead,
got a
wade in,
personal,
Larry, yeah.
Everybody's got a personal view on this stuff. But the Warren Commission has been looked at and looked at and looked at, and no one has ever come up, in my view, with a shred of evidence of anything but a lone gunman from the book depository committing the assassination. I don't think, I think about these conspiracy theories, it's sort of like Bernstein with Deep Throat in Watergate. I mean, this was just two guys, and one of them still had the talk before he died. So we all found out who Deep Throat was. And I can't imagine these conspiracies have dozens of people involved in all of this. To carry out that sort of conspiracy that involves moving bodies and all this stuff and who's paying for what and all that, I just think that somebody would have cashed in on this a long time ago.
Well, Larry,
that's my view.
I mean, way to end on a whopper. You said, and I quote, "There's not a shred of evidence." That's an insane thing to say. There is so much murky, inexplicable, crazy stuff. To say not a shred, you should say, there's no evidence that works for me, Larry Scogan. So we'll be talking about that.
There's no evidence that works for me. Okay.
Here's the thing that he said, and I said it so badly in my paraphrase. This is at UND. "Those of you who regard my profession of political life with disdain should remember that it made it possible for me to move from being an obscure lieutenant in the United States Navy to the commander-in-chief in 14 years with very little technical competence.
That is cute. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. We appreciate it.